The jarring, deliberate sound of a pilot ripping a young woman's ID in half tore through the subdued luxury of the business-class cabin. A collective gasp was the only answer. The pilot, a man with steel-gray temples and a uniform bristling with merit bars, sneered down at her. "Enjoy your flight." He had misread her composure as fragility, her youth for naivety. But he was profoundly mistaken. He could never have anticipated what she would composedly retrieve from her minimalist leather tote bag next. This isn't just a story about a conflict at 35,000 feet. It's the true-to-life account of how a decorated captain's prestigious career plummeted to the earth, all because he chose to wield his power against the one woman he should have revered most. Dr. Lena Petrova nestled into the supple leather of seat 3B with a quiet sigh. The business-class cabin of Zenith Air Flight 81 from San Francisco to Tokyo was an island of tranquility, a stark departure from the calculated turmoil she had just unleashed in the city's tech bro underworld. The deep, steady hum of the engines was a comforting balm on nerves pulled taut by weeks of cyber surveillance and a pre-dawn raid that had, thankfully, unfolded with surgical precision. For most, a trans-Pacific journey in this refined environment was the apex of success, a status symbol to be broadcast on social media. For Lena, it was a strategic imperative. She wasn't a venture capitalist or a Silicon Valley heiress. She was an instrument, finely calibrated by the Directorate of Special Operations, and her intellect was the most lethal part of her arsenal. At 31, she held a doctorate in cryptology and was one of the youngest directors to ever lead a task force in the DSO's fiercely guarded cyber warfare division. The man she had just placed in digital handcuffs, a shadowy data broker selling state secrets to foreign powers, had believed himself to be untouchable. Lena had proven him wrong. Now she was en route to Tokyo to brief Japan's Public Security Intelligence Agency, PSIA, on the international network her investigation had exposed. The business class ticket wasn't a luxury. It was a mandatory protocol for an operative carrying classified national security data, affording a higher degree of privacy and a swift exit upon landing. She looked the part of a young executive savoring her success, attired in tailored wool trousers, a simple cashmere sweater, and a jacket that cost more than a month's mortgage. The designer tote resting at her feet was a meticulously chosen piece of her cover. It was elegant, yet discreet, designed to assimilate, not to attract attention. Inside, tucked between a heavily annotated copy of The Art of War and a small pouch of Japanese phrasebooks, lay her service weapon and the credentials that granted her a level of authority few could imagine. A flight attendant, a bright-eyed young woman named Sophia, approached with a deferential smile. "Can I offer you something to drink before we depart, Dr. Petrova? Champagne, perhaps?" "Just some hot green tea, please," Lena responded, her voice smooth and measured. "Thank you, Sophia." Sophia's eyes widened slightly that Lena had used her name, printed on a small magnetic name tag. It was a minute detail, something Lena's training had hardwired her to notice. See everything, process everything, use everything. As Sophia hurried off, the pilot emerged from the cockpit to welcome the premium passengers. He was a tall man, likely in his late 50s, with an iron ramrod posture that bespoke a military past. His uniform was impeccable, adorned with pins and insignia that broadcast a long and lauded career. His name tag read Captain Marcus Thorne. He glided through the cabin with an air of absolute dominion, shaking hands with businessmen and offering paternalistic smiles to older women. His eyes swept over Lena, a brief, unreadable flicker before he moved on. It was a look she recognized instantly, a glance of appraisal, of categorization. Young, woman, alone, business class. In his mind, the variables didn't quite compute. Lena felt a familiar, weary knot form in her chest, but pushed it away. She was too exhausted for this drama, too fixated on the mission that lay ahead. She just wanted to sleep. The tea arrived, its steam fragrant and calming. The safety briefing commenced. Lena closed her eyes, not from apathy, but to visualize the next 48 hours. The secure handover of intelligence, the debrief with her Japanese counterparts, the collaborative analysis of their shared data. In her mind, she was already in Tokyo, her focus an unblinking laser. The aircraft pushed back from the gate, and the lights of San Francisco glittered like a spill of liquid diamonds as they climbed into the dark embrace of the Pacific night. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and the low murmur of cabin conversation resumed. Lena pulled out her book, hoping to immerse herself in ancient strategy before attempting to rest, but serenity was not on her flight plan. A shadow fell across her page. She looked up to see Captain Thorne standing in the aisle, his arms folded across his chest. His smile was gone, supplanted by a rigid, almost accusatory demeanor. "Ma'am," he began, his voice a low rumble that carried an unmistakable undertone of authority. "I'll need to verify a few things. Can I see your boarding pass again, please?" Lena blinked slowly, marking her page before reaching into her tote. Around them, other passengers began to notice, their conversations tapering off. The atmosphere shifted. The hermetic seal of business-class comfort had been breached. She handed him the pass. He scrutinized it for a beat too long. "Dr. Lena Petrova," he read aloud, the title sounding like a slur on his tongue. He glanced from the pass to her face and back again. "And what kind of doctor are you?" "The kind that values her privacy," Lena replied politely, but with a steel edge that offered no room for debate. She held out her hand for the boarding pass. He ignored her hand, his eyes narrowing. "You know, we've had some security issues recently. People managing to get into premium cabins where they don't belong. It's a major disturbance." The implication was as transparent as it was offensive. Lena felt a surge of hot fury, but instantly quelled it with the cold iron of her training. Do not react. Observe. Analyze. He wasn't just a pilot. He was a problem to be solved. "I assure you, Captain," she said, her voice perilously quiet. "I belong here." He let out a short, mirthless scoff. "I'm sure you think you do. But for airline security, I'm going to need to see a form of identification to match this boarding pass." It was a highly irregular demand, bordering on a violation of policy unless a tangible security threat existed. But Lena knew that arguing would only inflame the situation and attract more unwanted attention. With a sigh, she hoped projected mere irritation, she reached back into her tote, her fingers brushing the cold metal of her firearm, and retrieved her wallet. She extracted her California driver's license and handed it to him. This, she reasoned, would surely be the end of it. But for Captain Marcus Thorne, it was just the opening salvo. He had initiated a conflict he couldn't win, with a woman whose identity he couldn't possibly fathom. And in doing so, he was about to pilot his own life directly into a squall of catastrophic ruin. Captain Thorne took the driver's license from Lena's fingers, his touch asserting a small, final act of dominance. He held the small plastic card up to the ambient cabin light, rotating it as if it were a strange relic he had never seen before. The hush in the cabin deepened, heavy with the vicarious embarrassment of the other passengers. They were now watching openly, their pre-dinner cocktails suspended in mid-air. Sophia, the flight attendant, lingered near the galley, her face a painting of distress. "Dr. Lena Petrova," Thorne read from the license, his tone dripping with theatrical disbelief. He glanced at the photograph, then back at Lena, a condescending smirk tugging at his lips. "It's a good picture. Looks professional." "It's a driver's license, Captain," Lena stated, her patience wearing dangerously thin. Her training screamed at her to de-escalate, but the man before her seemed hell-bent on pushing her toward an edge. He wasn't just checking her identity, he was challenging her right to exist in that space. "The issue," Thorne went on, leaning in conspiratorially, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout, "is that these things are easily forged. A pretty girl like you'd be shocked what people will try to get a taste of luxury they haven't earned." The insult was a poisoned dart, layered and deeply personal. Pretty girl, haven't earned. He had stripped her of her title, her accomplishments, her very humanity, reducing her to a stereotype he harbored in his mind. A grifter. An imposter. The injustice of it was a toxic pill. All the years of sacrifice, of sleepless nights devouring cryptographic texts, of punishing physical and psychological conditioning, of facing down threats to national security. All of it erased in a heartbeat by the cheap prejudice of a man in a position of power. "Captain," Lena said, her voice now barely a whisper, yet each syllable was forged in steel. "Return my identification to me, now." Her direct command seemed to momentarily stun him. A flash of doubt flickered in his eyes. He had anticipated deference, maybe flustered justifications or even tears. He had not anticipated a direct order. But his pride, a colossal and brittle construct, quickly reasserted itself. He interpreted her command not as a warning, but as a challenge to his own supremacy. On this airplane, he was the final authority. He was the law. "I don't believe so," he said, shaking his head slowly. "I'm not convinced. This ID feels flimsy. The lamination seems to be peeling at the edge." He began to torque the card between his thumb and forefinger, a deliberate, provocative motion of destruction. "Stop," Lena commanded, her voice cold and sharp. Sophia, the flight attendant, took a brave step forward. "Captain, perhaps I could assist. I can verify her details against the gate agent's finalized manifest." Thorne shot her a withering glare. "Stand down, Sophia. I am the captain of this aircraft, and I am responsible for its security. I will not have my authority challenged." Sophia retreated, her face ashen. The plastic of the license groaned under the pressure of Thorne's fingers. He was relishing this. Lena saw it clearly now. The power, the public spectacle, the degradation of a young woman who, in his cramped worldview, was an anomaly. He was performing for his captive audience, reasserting his dominance for all to witness. "Is there a problem here?" A man in seat 4A, a stout executive named Mr. Davies, who had been loudly discussing a corporate acquisition, finally intervened. "For heaven's sake, Marcus, the lady is a passenger. Leave her be." Thorne's head snapped toward the man. "This is a security procedure, Mr. Davies. I'd appreciate it if you'd let me handle it." His use of the passenger's name was a naked power play, a reminder that he was in charge. He pivoted his attention back to Lena, a cruel smile now firmly planted on his face. He held the bent license up for her to see, the plastic turning a stressed, milky white. "Last chance. Who are you really?" Lena stared into his eyes, her mind a supercomputer running countless scenarios. Her mission in Tokyo was paramount. Any incident on this flight could jeopardize it, creating a diplomatic ripple, attracting unwanted press, and compromising her cover. The path of least resistance was to endure it, to swallow the indignity and address it quietly on the ground. But then she looked into his eyes and saw the raw, unadulterated pleasure he was deriving from his cruelty. And she thought of the fundamental injustice of the act. This wasn't about security. It was about power, misogyny, and prejudice. If she let him do this, to simply walk away unscathed after such a gross abuse of his authority, what did that say? Her entire life's work was dedicated to confronting bullies, whether they were nation-states or petty tyrants with pilot wings. She made a decision. The mission would have to absorb this new variable. "Captain Thorne," she said, her voice now utterly devoid of emotion, "I am going to give you one final opportunity to return my property and walk away. If you fail to do so, you will be making the single greatest miscalculation of your professional life." The ultimatum hung in the tense air, audacious and absolute. Thorne stared at her, his face flushing with rage. He had been a pilot for 30 years, a Navy aviator before that. No one spoke to him this way, especially not her. He barked a harsh, ugly laugh. "A miscalculation? Lady, you made the mistake when you tried to con your way onto my flight." And then, with a final, definitive act of contempt, he brought his hands together. Crack! The sound was shockingly loud in the tense cabin. He had snapped her driver's license in two. He dangled the two pieces between his fingers, then let them flutter onto her lap like confetti of disrespect. "Problem solved," he sneered, his chest puffed with victory. "We'll have the authorities meet you in Tokyo, and they can sort out who you really are. Enjoy your flight." He turned on his heel, ready to march back to his cockpit, the victor of a battle of his own making. He believed he had won. He believed he had put her back in her place. He never saw it coming. As he turned, Lena stood. Her movement was fluid and precise, with no trace of anger or haste. She was the calm at the eye of the storm. "Captain," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the cabin with the clarity of a diamond, stopping him mid-stride. He turned back, an exasperated expression on his face, ready to deliver another rebuke. But the words died on his lips. Dr. Lena Petrova was no longer looking at him. Her gaze was locked on a point just past him, and her hand was reaching into her minimalist leather tote. But this time, it wasn't her wallet she was retrieving. What goes through your mind in a moment like that? When confronted with such blatant injustice, does the desire for an immediate, emotional reaction outweigh the wisdom of strategic patience and a devastatingly calculated response? Time seemed to dilate. Every eye in the business class cabin was fixed on Lena as she stood, a silent, formidable presence in the aisle. Captain Thorne, who had turned back with an expression of supreme annoyance, now stood transfixed, his face a mural of bewilderment. He had been prepared for tears, for pleading, for impotent rage. He was entirely unprepared for the glacial composure that now stood before him. Lena's hand emerged from her tote bag. It held not a cell phone to complain, not another ID to be mocked, but a small black leather case. She didn't flourish it. She didn't wave it. She simply held it in her palm, her fingers perfectly steady, her expression a mask of neutrality. With a practiced flick of her thumb, she opened the case. Inside, displayed against the dark leather, rested a gleaming, eagle-crested medallion and a set of credentials. The iconic seal of a powerful, shadowy government entity was unmistakable. The bold letters beneath it spelled out a truth that shattered the reality of every person in that cabin. Directorate of Special Operations. Lena let the silence stretch for a beat, allowing the full import of the moment to settle. She then lifted her eyes to meet Thorne's. His face, which had been ruddy with arrogant pride just moments before, was now rapidly draining of all color. The smirk was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure, unadulterated disbelief. His eyes darted from the medallion to her face, a dawning, abject horror beginning to kindle in their depths. Special Operations Director Dr. Lena Petrova, she announced, her voice calm, clear, and imbued with an authority that eclipsed his own. Directorate of Special Operations, and you, Captain, have a profoundly serious problem. A collective, audible gasp swept through the cabin. The executive, Mr. Davies, sat bolt upright, his jaw hanging open. Sophia, the flight attendant, brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. This was no longer a matter of a rude pilot. They were witnessing something far more momentous and frightening. Lena took a deliberate step forward, halving the distance between them. Thorne instinctively took a step back, a reflexive retreat from a threat he was only now beginning to process. "Let me be exceptionally clear about what has just occurred," Lena continued, her tone as clinical as if she were dissecting a piece of code. "You have, in full view of multiple witnesses, willfully and illegally destroyed government-issued identification belonging to a federal officer." She took another step. He took another back. "More significantly," she went on, her gaze drilling into his, "you have, through your unwarranted, prejudiced, and frankly pathetic actions, interfered with a federal agent in the active performance of her duties. That, Captain Thorne, is a serious federal offense. Title 18, Section 111 of the U.S. Code, for your reference. It carries a penalty of up to 8 years in federal prison. I should know. I've put people away for it." The mention of prison, of a specific criminal statute, was like a physical blow to Thorne's face. The last vestiges of his bravado vanished, replaced by the stark, frigid terror of a man who suddenly grasps he has made a cataclysmic, life-altering mistake. His universe had been turned on its head in less than a minute. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been inverted with breathtaking efficiency. He was no longer the master of this metal tube. He was a potential felon, facing a woman who embodied the full might of the United States government. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice a frail, reedy whisper. It was the classic, desperate bleat of a man caught in an inescapable trap. "You are not paid to know, Captain," Lena countered, her voice mercilessly sharp. "You are paid to fly an aircraft and ensure the safety and dignity of your passengers, not to enact your sad, prejudiced power fantasies. My identity was not your business. Your behavior was a gross, flagrant abuse of the authority vested in you by your airline and the Federal Aviation Administration." She paused, letting her words penetrate. She could see the frantic calculations in his eyes, the desperate search for an emergency exit that did not exist. He was cornered. "Now," Lena said, her tone shifting from prosecutorial to command. "This is what is going to happen. Your first officer will assume command of this aircraft for the duration of the flight to Tokyo. You will return to the cockpit, you will sit in the jump seat, and you will touch nothing. You will not speak to air traffic control. You will not communicate with anyone but me. Are my instructions crystal clear?" He could only manage a slight, trembling nod, his body quivering. The man who had sneered and puffed out his chest was now utterly hollowed out, a deflated shell of the authority figure he had pretended to be. Lena then shifted her gaze to the first officer, a younger man named Ben Carter, who had been watching the entire spectacle from the cockpit doorway with a horrified expression. "First Officer Ben Carter, is that correct?" Lena asked. "Yes, ma'am," he stammered. "First Officer Carter, you are now in command of this aircraft. Your captain is experiencing a security-related medical issue and has been relieved of his duties. Your flight plan remains unchanged. Continue to Narita as scheduled. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Understood," Ben replied, his voice shaky but resolute. He understood he was being given an order he could not and would not refuse. Lena then addressed the terrified Sophia. "Sophia, please collect the 2 pieces of my destroyed license. Place them in an air sickness bag and hand it to me. It is now evidence." Sophia nodded quickly, her hands trembling as she stooped to retrieve the plastic shards from Lena's seat. Finally, Lena turned back to the ghost-white Captain Thorne. She leaned in close, her voice a lethal whisper intended only for him. "You thought you were dealing with some girl you could push around. You were mistaken. You were dealing with the consequences of your own character, Marcus, and they are just getting started." She used his first name, stripping him of his title, of his last shred of dignity. It was a final, devastating strike. With that, she gestured with her head towards the cockpit. "Go." Captain Marcus Thorne, the decorated veteran, the king of his airborne castle, turned and shuffled brokenly toward the cockpit, a man walking toward the smoldering wreckage of his own life. The cabin door clicked shut behind him, leaving the passengers of Flight 81 in a stunned, profound silence. It's a breathtaking shift in power, isn't it? Does true authority come from a uniform and a title? Or does it come from the unshakable competence and character of the person holding it? The click of the cockpit door was like a judge's gavel, signaling the end of one man's dominion and the start of a long, terrifying plummet from grace. Inside the confined flight deck, the air was thick with a tension that felt more dangerous than any storm front. First Officer Ben Carter, a skilled pilot with over a decade of experience, found himself in a scenario no flight simulator had ever covered. His captain, the man who had been his mentor, the unflappable veteran Marcus Thorne, was collapsed in the jump seat behind him, looking like a specter. Thorne stared blankly at the dazzling array of illuminated instruments, but didn't register them. He saw only the cold gleam of the medallion in the unwavering eyes of the woman who had presented it. The words echoed in his skull. Federal offense, 8 years in prison, consequences. It was a waking nightmare at 37,000 feet. The velocity of his downfall was vertiginous. Minutes ago, he had been the master of his universe, dispensing his own form of petty justice. Now he was a pariah in his own cockpit, divested of his authority, his dignity, and quite possibly his entire future. A wave of sickness washed over him. It wasn't just fear. It was a deep, soul-shattering humiliation. He had constructed his whole identity around his career, his standing as a senior captain for a premier international airline. He was Captain Thorne, a title that elicited respect, that smoothed his way through the world, that defined him. Who was he without it? Just Mark Thorne, a man in his late 50s with a hefty mortgage, a string of failed relationships, and a son who rarely spoke to him. A man who had just incinerated it all for a fleeting moment of ugly, satisfying cruelty. Why had he done it? The question hammered at him. He scrambled for the justifications that had seemed so righteous just moments before. Security, protocol, suspicious behavior. But the words felt like flimsy cardboard props. The truth, raw and irrefutable, began to claw its way out from the depths of his self-delusion. He hadn't seen a security risk. He had seen a young, confident woman sitting in a seat he felt she hadn't earned, and it had violated his sense of order, his rigid, prejudiced worldview. Her quiet self-assurance had enraged him, and he had set out to shatter it. Instead, he had shattered himself. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, Director Lena Petrova was calmly restoring equilibrium. The shocked hush had morphed into a flurry of frantic whispers. Lena, recognizing the need for control and reassurance, addressed the business class passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly through the hushed cabin. "My name is Lena Petrova. I am a federal agent. There has been an incident involving the flight captain which has been neutralized. The flight is in no danger. First Officer Carter is in command, and we will be proceeding to Tokyo as planned. I would ask for your cooperation in remaining calm. A member of the flight crew will be by to collect the names and contact information of everyone in this section before we land." Her composure was absolute, the practiced authority of someone who navigates chaos for a living. Mr. Davies, the executive, regarded her with newfound reverence, a flicker of fear in his eyes. He had witnessed a total inversion of the power hierarchy, and it was a humbling spectacle. Lena resumed her seat, and Sophia approached, holding out a sealed white paper bag. "I have it, ma'am, Director." "Thank you, Sophia," Lena said, taking the bag. "You conducted yourself professionally." Sophia looked as though a great burden had been lifted. "He's always been like that. Arrogant, a bully to the junior crew. I am so sorry you had to endure that." "It's not you who needs to apologize, Sophia," Lena said, offering a small, reassuring nod. For the next 8 hours, the flight proceeded in a state of surreal tension. The veneer of business-class luxury had been stripped away, replaced by the palpable reality of a federal incident in motion. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with a skittish energy, their professional smiles looking brittle. Passengers spoke in hushed tones, stealing glances at Lena, who appeared to be engrossed in her book, and then toward the cockpit door, as if they could see the disgraced captain through the solid partition. Lena wasn't reading. She was processing. She used the aircraft's satellite phone to place a single, heavily encrypted call to a secure line at DSO headquarters in Virginia. She spoke in quiet, coded phrases, her voice a low murmur. "Archangel is proceeding on schedule," she said, using the code name for her mission. "Encountered unexpected atmospheric interference, domestic in nature. Situation is contained, but ground support will be necessary at destination. Standard protocol for agent interference. I repeat, the package is secure, but I'll require a reception committee." The voice on the other end would have understood instantly. Atmospheric interference, agent interference. These were keywords that triggered a complex and serious protocol. It meant an agent's authority had been challenged, their official duties obstructed. It meant that when Zenith Air Flight 81 touched down in Japan, it would not be a standard arrival. As the flight descended over the Japanese coastline, the aircraft was diverted away from the passenger terminal at Narita International Airport. Instead, it was guided to a remote, isolated hard stand where a reception of official vehicles awaited, their presence a silent, ominous confirmation of the incident's gravity. Thorne saw them from the cockpit window and felt the last of his strength leave him. He had just piloted himself into his own personal ruin. Imagine being a passenger witnessing that scene as you land. Is there a certain grim satisfaction in seeing consequences delivered so swiftly and decisively? Or does it evoke a more complex feeling of pity for the man whose life has just publicly and irrevocably imploded? The wheels kissed the tarmac at Narita International with a gentle bump. But for Marcus Thorne, it felt as if the world had just fallen away beneath him. The landing was perfect, a final testament to First Officer Ben Carter's professionalism under duress. But the customary taxi to the passenger gate never commenced. As soon as Flight 81 cleared the active runway, an official-looking vehicle with flashing lights intercepted them, guiding the airliner away from the commercial terminals toward a desolate, isolated section of the airfield. It was the aviation equivalent of being pulled into a dark, abandoned alley. Every passenger with a window seat saw what was waiting for them. Parked on the gray concrete were not the usual baggage carts and catering trucks. Instead, 2 black sedans and a dark blue van with the insignia of the Japanese Ministry of Justice stood in stark formation. A handful of men in dark, conservative suits stood beside the vehicles, their posture formal, their faces impassive. They were undeniably law enforcement, a mix of Japanese officials and American agents from the U.S. Embassy. For the passengers who had witnessed the drama, it was a chilling confirmation of the event's severity. For Captain Thorne, it was his nightmare made manifest. Inside the cockpit, Thorne could see his welcoming committee. The blood evacuated his face, leaving him with a pasty, sickly complexion. "Ben," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Don't let them. Tell them it was all a misunderstanding." Ben Carter looked at him, not with pity, but with a weary contempt. "There's nothing to tell, Mark. You did this. You have to face it." The engine spooled down with a final, mournful whine. The jet bridge was not coming. Instead, a mobile staircase was rolled to the main cabin door. Lena stood and straightened her jacket. She addressed the cabin one last time. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until instructed otherwise. This will be handled as expediently as possible." The cabin door was opened by a flight attendant, and a tall, grim-faced man in a tailored suit stepped aboard. He made eye contact with Lena and gave a subtle, confirming nod. He was the DSO's station chief from the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. Lena had summoned the cavalry. "Director Petrova," the man said, his voice a low baritone. "We have the situation contained on the ground." "Thank you, John," Lena replied. She then turned her head toward the cockpit. "Please escort Captain Marcus Thorne from the flight deck." Two more agents, one Japanese from the PSIA and another American, boarded the aircraft. They moved with a silent, intimidating efficiency that permitted no argument. They disappeared into the cockpit and emerged a moment later with Thorne between them. He was not in handcuffs. That would come later, discreetly. But their hands were clamped firmly on his upper arms. His pilot's hat was gone, his tie was crooked. He looked utterly demolished, his eyes darting wildly at the faces of the passengers, the very people he had been so keen to perform for. He saw no sympathy in their eyes, only a mixture of awe, fear, and disdain. His public humiliation was absolute. As they guided him toward the open door, his eyes met Lena's one last time. In them, she saw a desperate, pleading question. Why? Lena offered no reply. Her expression was a mask of professional neutrality. Her duty was to the law and the mission, not to the emotional state of the man who had attempted to debase her. She simply watched as he was escorted down the stairs and put into the back of one of the black sedans. The door closed with a solid, final thud. The career of Captain Marcus Thorne was officially, irrevocably over. The repercussions were instantaneous and cataclysmic. First came the airline. Before the sedan had even departed the tarmac, Zenith Air's corporate headquarters in Chicago was in full-blown crisis mode. The report from the Tokyo station chief, coupled with a blistering official complaint filed by the Directorate of Special Operations, sent shockwaves through the C-suite. The airline's chief of security reviewed the sworn statements from Ben Carter, Sophia, and other business-class passengers. The narrative was damning and unwavering. Thorne's actions were not a misunderstanding. They were a clear-cut, indefensible abuse of power, tainted by undeniable prejudice. Within 12 hours, before he could even arrange for a flight back to the United States as a disgraced passenger, Marcus Thorne was summarily fired. His termination letter, delivered by a cold corporate email, cited gross misconduct, endangerment of the flight through dereliction of core duties, and behavior causing irreparable harm to the airline's global reputation. His employee credentials were revoked, his extensive travel benefits vaporized, and his final paycheck was docked to help cover the costs of the operational and diplomatic disruption he had caused. The airline, terrified of a monumental lawsuit and the impending PR nightmare, moved to amputate all ties with surgical precision. Next came the Federal Aviation Administration. The FAA does not treat the obstruction of a flight crew's duties lightly, especially when the instigator is the captain himself. The DSO's report was flagged for immediate and priority review. An investigation was launched, but it was merely a formality. With sworn testimony from a DSO director, a first officer, a flight attendant, and multiple high-profile passengers, the outcome was preordained. The FAA issued an emergency revocation of Thorne's airline transport pilot license, the pinnacle of civilian aviation certification. Without it, he couldn't legally fly a single-engine Cessna, let alone a multi-million-dollar wide-body jet. Finally, there was the Department of Justice. Lena's report was factual, dispassionate, and devastating. She detailed the sequence of events, citing the specific statute Thorne had violated. While the U.S. Attorney's Office held prosecutorial discretion, the circumstances were too egregious to overlook. This was a direct assault on the authority of a federal officer, and failing to prosecute would set a dangerous precedent. A federal warrant was issued for his arrest upon his eventual return to American soil, on charges of interference with a federal agent. The news broke a day later. An internal leak from Zenith Air, likely from an executive eager to publicly distance the company from Thorne, found its way to a prominent aviation reporter. The headline was "Viral Dynamite. Hero Pilot Fired. Faces federal charges after destroying undercover Fed's ID on Tokyo flight." His downfall was swift and total. While Marcus Thorne's world was being publicly and systematically dismantled, Lena Petrova was in a secure briefing room in Kasumigaseki, methodically laying out a complex web of financial data to a rapt audience of PSIA and National Police Agency officers. The incident on the plane was behind her. It was a problem identified, contained, and resolved. She was back on mission, her focus absolute. Judge Samuel Ramirez peered down from the bench, his expression not of anger, but of a profound, heavy disappointment that was somehow far worse. "Mr. Thorne," he began, his voice pinning the defendant in place. "For 30 years, this country placed its trust in you. It trusted you with billion-dollar machines and with the lives of its citizens. Your uniform and your wings were symbols of that sacred trust." Thorne stood rigid, his hands clasped behind his back in a pathetic pantomime of military discipline. "And you betrayed that trust," the judge continued, "not through a technical error, but through a far more insidious failure. A failure of character. You appointed yourself the arbiter of who belongs, and you used the authority given to you to protect a passenger as a weapon to humiliate her. What your lawyer calls a lapse in judgment, this court calls a gross, despicable abuse of power. The sentence was a work of karmic genius. No prison time, which his lawyer tried to spin as a victory, but a punishment far more intimate and psychologically crushing. 2 years of probation, a crippling fine that would devour his savings, and 500 hours of community service. The location of that service was the final, devastating blow. A logistics and sorting warehouse for a global aid charity, located on the windswept perimeter of San Francisco International Airport. The judge chose rehabilitation over simple incarceration. Do you think this form of punishment, forcing Thorne to confront his irrelevance and serve others in the shadow of his former glory, is more just and effective than a prison cell? His first day was a descent into a tailored hell. He drove his old, beat-up sedan through the airport's cargo entrance, a route he had only ever viewed from a cockpit window. The thunderous roar of a Boeing 777 taking off rattled his car, a sound that had once been his life's symphony, now felt like a personal taunt. The warehouse was a cavernous tomb of good intentions, the air thick with the smell of cardboard and industrial soap. His supervisor was a man named Miguel, who looked barely 30, with a kind but weary face. He didn't recognize Thorne. To him, he was just Mark, the new court-ordered volunteer. "Okay, Mark," Miguel said, handing him work gloves and a box cutter. "We need these shipments of donated clothing sorted. Easy peasy." Thorne looked at the mountain of black plastic bags filled with other people's cast-off lives. He, Captain Marcus Thorne, who had once navigated a 300-ton aircraft through a typhoon, was now tasked with sorting second-hand sweaters. As he worked, his back aching, a sleek Zenith Air A350, identical to the one he used to fly, climbed gracefully into the sky. He stopped, his hands frozen in a pile of old jeans, and watched until it was just a silver speck. It was a phantom limb, that feeling of flight. A hot, bitter rage surged in his chest, but he looked at the indifferent faces around him, and the rage curdled into a cold, heavy shame. He was nothing here. He was just Mark, sorting clothes. The call to his son, Leo, was even worse. "I saw the article, Dad," Leo said, his voice cold. "And the video a passenger posted online. You were a bully. You let your own ugly prejudice destroy you. Don't call me to explain. There's nothing to explain." The line went dead. Rock Bottom arrived on a Tuesday night. He was in his small, rented apartment, eating canned soup over the sink when a commercial for Zenith Air appeared on the television. A world of smiling pilots and exotic destinations from which he was permanently banished. A visceral sob escaped his throat, and he slid to the floor, weeping for his lost career, his son's contempt, his lost life. In that moment of total brokenness, the walls of his denial crumbled. Why did I do it? It wasn't about security. It was about her, her youth, her gender, her quiet confidence. It was the way she sat in that seat, as if she belonged there. A place he, on some deep, unexamined level, believed was reserved for people who looked like him. He had tried to put her in her place, and the universe had savagely put him in his. He finally admitted the word to the empty room, a choked whisper. Racist. The confession, though agonizing, was the first step out of the wreckage. It's often only at our lowest point that we are forced to see ourselves clearly. How difficult is it to confront the ugliest parts of one's own character? And does that self-awareness hold any value if it only comes after everything has been lost? 18 months later, the raw anger had cooled into a permanent, low-grade ache of resignation. He arrived at the warehouse, clocked in, and began sorting medical supplies without protest. The roar of the jets was no longer an insult, just a feature of the landscape. He paused, his hands full of sterile bandages, and watched another Zenith Air jet taxi toward the runway. He felt a familiar pang, but it was distant now, a memory belonging to another man. High above him, in a discreet VIP lounge, Dr. Lena Petrova was reviewing a sensitive file for her flight to Zurich. Her mission was to track illicit financial flows funding a new brand of corporate espionage. She glanced out the window, her gaze sweeping the tarmac with ingrained situational awareness. Her eyes passed over the distant figure of a cargo handler, and for a fractional second, her mind, a finely tuned instrument of analysis, pulled up a file. Thorne, Marcus, male, late 50s, Caucasian. She made a quick, subconscious assessment. No threat, contained, irrelevant. She felt nothing, no victory, no pity. He was simply data, a closed case, a problem that had been solved. His ruin was a self-inflicted wound, the inevitable result of his own choices. The intercom announced the boarding of her flight. Lena stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked toward the gate. Outside, the Zenith Air jet Marcus Thorne was watching began its powerful takeoff roll. It climbed steeply, a symbol of progress and forward momentum, leaving the gray tarmac and the diminished figure of its former captain far below. He was grounded by the heavy gravity of his past, while she ascended, weightless, toward the future. This is the final image, one life ascending, another permanently grounded. Is this the perfect definition of karma, or simply the logical and inevitable outcome when prejudice collides with a force it cannot comprehend? What are your final thoughts on the nature of justice in this story?